Before I get started in this episode, I would encourage you to listen to the previous episodes in this series as I talk about concepts, ideas, and events in more detail than I gloss over in this episode. You should be able to follow along, but some things may make more sense with the historical context I gave in previous episodes. On a side note, I would like to suggest everyone go over to the Stats on Stats podcast on YouTube or statsonstat.io and listen to the latest episodes. One of my favorite things about security, tech, and just people in general is hearing the ideas that made them pursue the career path they did. Also, I enjoy the thoughts of people who may see the world differently than I do. And all of this is to say that Jordan and Tiffany are doing big things over there, and you don't want to miss it. Welcome to the Intrusions Indepth podcast. This is Josh Stepp. Today, I want to do something a little different. Inspired by the Olympics going on right now, I think this is the best time to do my own set of mental gymnastics. With that being said, I didn't originally plan to make this episode as being part of the PhineasFisher series, but after bringing up Joseph Men's reference to PhineasFisher being a Russian asset in episode 2 of the series, you should listen to it. I got an email stating that I should look into it further. So I did that. And that's why we're here. I want to be upfront as I feel like some of these discussions teeter into like the tinfoil hat area. Some of it's a stretch and requires you to piece together concepts from other incidents, events that don't seem connected. So all of this is to say that I haven't drank the Kool-Aid on this idea, but it is interesting. So I thought I would share it. I'll do my best the entire episode to reiterate that these are data points that you should consider. Just because they are being brought up doesn't mean that they are the proverbial smoking gun to PhineasFisher wearing a Yushchenko or drinking vodka or doing the bidding of the Kremlin. The AKP dump and release, as well as the whole WikiLeaks thing and support for Rojava, is still the outlier in my opinion. It's the weird data point. Maybe it's just that. Maybe it's where they made a mistake. Maybe they stretched the PhineasFisher persona too far, too long. But before we go any further, let's not get sued.
The information presented in this show is sourced from publicly available materials and does not contain any classified or proprietary content. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests alone and do not reflect the official policy or position of their employers or any affiliated organizations. Enjoy the show.
In this episode, I want to start with something of history lessons of sorts, which appears to be a trend on this podcast. And it's on arguably a similar set of events, followed by a discussion of the NKWT crew, a hacking group active slightly earlier than PhineasFisher. Then we'll pivot into some of the analysis done on the AKP attack and how the tactics, techniques, and procedures resemble those in other attacks that match alleged Russian activity as well. We also tie into some of the indicators of compromise, IOCs here. Lastly, we'll discuss WikiLeaks' role in all of this. But to start, the most intriguing piece of the PhineasFisher saga is how they eluded capture or being doxxed or just how they kind of vanished. APT crews seem to get away with their attacks because they operate out of countries usually not affiliated with the target country. Whether it's for another country's government or they're just moonlighting with immunity. For example, the United States have brought charges against Chinese operators from APT-1, also known as Unit 61398 of the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. They've also announced charges and showed pictures of APT-28 operators. Some would say they were Fancy Bears. Fancy Bears being like the code name for APT-28. And then there's the Lazarus Group and the charges brought against North Korean attackers after they targeted Sony. I think there's some more Chinese crews being doxxed for their part in various operations as well. But does the United States expect those nations to call the Department of Justice and arrange extraditions since they have been charged with the crime in America? Absolutely not. That's comical if you actually do believe that. Well, what does it do? Well, it gets your name and picture out there. Lets everyone know that the United States knows who you are, and, well, now everyone knows who you are. It makes it incredibly difficult to travel outside of your own country protecting you, and in some cases, it could make you a target yourself. I don't think Alexander Ermakov is connected to the Russian government, but Australia, then the US, and the UK sanctioned this individual. I know it's not an arrest warrant, but this was all based off of their role in the Medibank attack. Does anyone expect this individual to be arrested in Russia because of it? Probably not. But does it tell a bunch of Russian criminals who has a lot of Bitcoin? Yeah. Does it send a message? Does it make an example out of him? Yeah. And full transparency here, I have conflicts with this tactic. On one hand, I like the aggressive approach to try and stop these bad faith actors, attackers, etc., from ruining people's lives with the dumping of personal information or ransomwaring businesses. But on the other hand, my intuition is to be critical of government power, especially if the evidence for such measures isn't transparent. Maybe it's just an American thing. I have friends from other countries who seem to be okay with the government having this sort of power. Maybe I just have trust issues. But there's no skin in the game for governments getting this wrong. And this can be a scenario in which people are throwing stones in glass houses. Other countries have stolen sensitive data on U.S. military members, and this could get nasty real fast. But in the case of PhineasFisher, they have escaped pretty much all the charges, the investigations, etc. This seems odd, at least to me. It's not a smoking gun by any means, though. But all the targets are in Western countries, Italy, Germany, Turkey, Isle of Man, etc. But this could just be a data point. Maybe the target selection was good and that no one cared to help these companies. Italian authorities didn't like the backlash from the hacking team dump. Turkey was in the middle of a coup / purge of government officials at the time. And the bank didn't seem too eager to announce that they were breached, ever. So it's possible. But I've read too many books to not at least consider that when someone gets away with something so brazen, so obvious, that there's a high likelihood of them being connected to the government, like an informant or something. A strategist, as Whitey Bulger wanted to be called. It's a pretty sweet gig. You get to kill your enemies with impunity from law enforcement in front of tons of people and have the FBI take out your competition if you're a gangster like Whitey Bulger. However, there are downsides that you eventually go to jail, and in prison, inmates tend to look down on people being a rat, which could make the prison experience more difficult. So the idea is that PhineasFisher would be protected as maybe they were doing the bidding of another government, like the Russian government. Like I said, I'm not convinced of this, but it's one data point worth considering. And this has happened before with a Russian double agent of sorts named Maxim Igor Popov. And I'm sorry if I mispronounced that first name. Now, the story of Popov is a wild ride through the early days of cybercrime. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, Popov was part of a network of Russian hackers and scammers operating on the underground forums like tech.net.ru and Carter Planet and Shadow Crew. These guys were into everything from stealing and selling credit card information to just straight up extortion. They sound like a real wholesome bunch. But then the FBI started closing in. They launched Operation Flyhook to track down and arrest some of Popov's associates. The feds lured them to Seattle under false pretenses and snagged them and retrieved a gold mine of data on their hacking activities. The false pretenses being that they offered them a job and they had to go to Seattle to interview. Now, these arrests caused some serious friction between US and Russia. The United States claimed that they attempted to coordinate with the Russian government through diplomatic channels on this operation to gather the digital evidence needed because they feared it would be deleted or destroyed. After a week and a half of waiting, only to be ignored by the Russians, the Americans used stolen credentials to access the system and pull down 2 gigabytes of data. The Russians, on the other hand, claim that they have no record of these communications. It's pretty convenient. So the FSB, which is loosely like the American FBI, there's some like border protection and intelligence efforts in there, charged the FBI agents in response to them accessing the system. During the investigation, one name kept popping up, Max. Another name for Popoff, or another name that Popoff operated under. So Popoff found himself in a tight spot, facing years in prison, but he had an ace up his sleeve. He offered to flip and help the FBI infiltrate the hacker networks that he was plugged into. Agent Hilbert and the feds took him up on this, and suddenly Popoff was working undercover, gathering intel and evidence against his former comrades in cybercrime. An informant? More like a strategist. Now, it was a risky game that Popoff was playing, straddling both sides of the law. He fed the FBI information while still engaging in his own schemes, like when he linked up with Sabu, another hacker turned informant, and they plotted some wild disinformation campaigns and cyber attacks together. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Sabu was a member of LulzSec, a sort of political hacktivist group. I'll do a future episode on them. One thing about Popoff was that he was always working an angle, whether it was like personal enrichment, sowing international chaos, or just playing competing factions against one another. He'd leak sensitive information to further his agenda, like when he got early access to the WikiLeaks Syria files. But who else leaked data to WikiLeaks? Anyway, Popoff was a master manipulator. I'll link Emma Best's article to this show, as it goes into more detail than I want to here, but Popoff would start his own business, then get the FBI to write a letter of recommendation that he could post on his website as sort of a testimonial, while the FBI knew that he was extorting EMC, a Boston government contractor, at the same time. Now, this led to Agent Hilbert being accused and investigated for being a double agent, claiming he was protecting his informant. One significant account involving Popoff and Sabu was in 2011 and centered around the data dump from, sorry in advance, the Central National Anti-Crime Informatico per la Protezione del Infrastructure Critiche, CNAIPIC, the Italian cyber police. And I'm sorry to every Italian that just had to listen to that. I'll be calling them CNAIPIC going forward. And once again, I'm sorry to every person that had to suffer through that. Popoff and Sabu got into an arrangement of sorts where they would amplify each other's hacks. Popoff wanted Sabu to help amplify these files, as he claimed that they showed some worldwide conspiracy involved the world's governments and corporations. Man, Popoff would love the WEF. Despite being credited to LOAD, Legion of Anonymous Doom, a hacking group, and the NKW crew, another hacking group that I'll talk about in a bit, it was criticized by the Belarusian KGB as being an FBI asset operation. They weren't wrong, though. Sabu and Popoff did have ties to the FBI. But why did the Belarusian KGB think this? Because they claimed the FBI implanted false documents and forgeries to show that the KGB was supplying weapons to Pakistan. And let's take a step back. And this was two FBI informants with this dump, and these forged documents and fake documents appeared. So, I mean, while I can't say that the Belarusian KGB are moral characters, I can say that this could seem like that on the surface. Now, this is concerning because in late 2009 or so, Pakistan's government wasn't stable, and the country became a training ground for Islamic fighters, especially those coming from Europe. Also, in May of 2011, SEAL Team 6 conducted an operation named Neptune Spear, in which they infiltrated Osama bin Laden's Pakistani compound and killed the al-Qaeda leader. So you could say Pakistan was in a bit of the global spotlight at the time. Anyway, Anonymous, another hacking group, helped analyze the documents and got suspicious of their purpose and the authenticity as well. The documents had phone home malware in them. beacons to kind of expose the reader's identity when they open the file. Anonymous encouraged people to open the documents offline, but that way it wouldn't beacon back home. Furthermore, a friendly source within the CNA PIC claimed that the document's IDs didn't match. A large subset of the documents had been forged. Suspicions of this being a huge FBI or law enforcement operation to discredit Anonymous began. Popoff and Sabu drew suspicion as well because of how much they were promoting the documents. This is a quote from Emma Best's article. Quote, future releases in the CNA PIC series focused on load, omitting references to NKWT crew. The latter of the two alleged groups seem to have disappeared. It wouldn't reemerge until 2015 when an ostensible Italian group using the NKWT moniker registered a website enlisting their alleged members, including the well-known hacker Swiss-Italian Fry, listed as the ex-founder. And they claim credit for various exploits, including Popoff's CNA PIC hack, end quote. So Popoff is hard to nail down as he was a chaos agent of sorts, operating under different names and would often pit the identities against each other. Usually, the idea is to have your different personas never interact with each other, but Popoff marched to the beat of a different drum. There was also a lie being spread that the CNA PIC breach was the work of Italian hackers, but the narrative was about to be blown wide open by Popoff himself, operating under the alias Yalma Tough. In private chats with Sabu back in January of 2012, Popoff took credit for the CNA PIC hack. He claimed to be part of a group of hacktivists calling themselves the Lord of Dharmaraju, or LOD for short. The group was supposedly based out of India. Now, Sabu was skeptical at first. I mean, anyone can claim responsibility for a hack, right? And he knew Load and NKWT had as well. But Popoff had the receipts. He was able to accurately describe the person who handed over the CNA PIC files to Sabu in the first place. Popoff referred to this intermediary as the guy without a nickname and explained that he served as Load's enforcer arm in Pakistan. There were details that only someone with inside knowledge of the hack and group behind it would know. So with that, Popoff had effectively exposed the lie that Italian hackers were to blame for the CNA PIC breach. Instead, he was pointing the finger at a mysterious hacktivist collective and their alleged Pakistan enforcer. Now, this is all super confusing and part of the strategy. The goal, keep people guessing, make it hard. Additionally, Popoff would explain to security researcher Jeffrey Carr that, quote, the FSB regularly recruits black hats for contract work, and one of the standing orders is to leave evidence pointing to an entirely different government as the perpetrator of the attack. At one point in his chat with Sabu, Popoff admits that he's not Hindu and that the moniker exists to throw people off the trail of his true identity, end quote. That's another Emma Best quote, just if anyone's following. Now, does this sound familiar? Guccifer 2.0? Cyber Burkut? Possibly PhineasFisher? Eventually, Popoff went bigger. He stole Symantec's source code and wanted to monetize it. He asked Sabu to help with the research and look into bugs within the source code so they could use for different operations, while at the same time, Popoff was in communications with the FBI agent acting like a rep from Symantec to get paid for the extortion. It's literally the FBI informants talking with the FBI about crimes the informants did. No one is not FBI here. What is going on? Anyway, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange get into all of this. Popoff tells Sabu about all these plans, and Popoff shares a Brazilian police server's credentials that they had breached with Sabu as a show of goodwill or something along those lines. Sabu turns around and relays this information to Jeffrey Hyman, another member of Anonymous. I could possibly do an episode on him, to be honest, but he got cyber fraud and abuse acted pretty hard. And this led to communications with Assange and the WikiLeaks team. Sabu then tells Hammond that Assange is planning for them to hack Kroll. Now, why is this interesting? Well, it's attackers conspiring against an organization, but the head of the cyber investigations for Kroll was Agent Hilbert. Well, former Agent Hilbert, Popoff's earlier handler. Popoff also had an idea to hack Israel from Saudi Arabia's servers to act as a false flag event to create a real cyber war. That sounds great. Which, to be honest, would have probably put those two nations in a hot war, leaving the United States in a weird spot as both of them have relations with the American government. Quoting from the article for the last time. According to Popoff, the details of the conspiracy would depend on the goal. In the instance of the semantic source code, he claimed the purpose was to up Pakistan by confronting India and USA, with the source code supposedly having been taken from the servers of an Indian military intelligence agency. Quote, "Together we can do many good and evil things, brother," Popoff told Sabu, end quote. Popoff would also change targets. Instead, focusing on everything but Russia, he described goals to focus on the Russian bloc and create a new persona to do so. He had some involvement in the WikiLeaks Syria papers, and it appears that he was playing for the Americans, the Russians, and himself, depending on the persona that he used. And this went on for years. Even after his time with the FBI, he reemerged under a new name, RU Cyborg, in 2014, leaking data in support of Ukraine. His motivations were murky, but he appeared to be angry that Russia had annexed Crimea. Well, until another persona of Popoff's emerged, Yamatov. Yamatov aligned themselves with Russian attackers and attacked the Ukrainian Prosecutor General Vitaly Yerema. One thing that was common in Popoff's releases was the amount of forged documents included in them. Then, in 2015, NKWT reemerged on the scene and claimed credit for a number of Popoff's previous releases. Well, this is awkward. Popoff pioneered false flag cyber operations and disinformation campaigns that created real diplomatic crises. The tactics and strategies he used back then created the playbook for later Russian cyber operations, like Gucci 2.0 and DC leaks, and the fronts that targeted the 2016 U.S. elections. And there's strong evidence that Popoff was working for both the FBI and the KGB at the same time. Informant for one and possible contractor for the other. Popoff earned the attention of American, Belarusian, Chinese, Egyptian, Italian, Pakistani, and Ukrainian authorities, along with numerous corporations. His stated goal was to create conflict and cyber war between nations using disinformation and false flag attacks. This is like a Batman villain. And at several points, Popoff's releases targeted Russian interests, which would have brought him to the attention of Russia's secret security services, in the highly unlikely event that they weren't already watching it. I don't think it's much of a stretch that he was working for them, or that they maybe just approved these hits. So just to highlight some of the similarities. PhineasFisher grabbed headlines when they hacked the Turkish government, leaking sensitive emails and documents from the ruling AK party. It was a politically motivated attack designed to expose corruption and support protest movements in Turkey. The MO reminded me of Popoff's strategically timed leaks, like the Syrian files, which he seemed to deploy to shape the geopolitical narratives in line with Russian interests. PhineasFisher pulled off their most audacious attack, or their most popular one, the Hacking Team breach. This was an Italian company selling spyware to authoritarian governments around the world. Again, it was like a hacktivist operation, meant to expose the misdeeds of the surveillance industry. But the sheer scale and impact of the hack also brought to mind Popoff's tactical leaks, which often involved huge troves of stolen data. Although I don't think forged documents have appeared in the Hacking Team docs. Now, I'm not saying Popoff and PhineasFisher are the same person. I don't think that's true at all, actually. The timelines don't quite match up, and their targets were different. But I do think PhineasFisher might have taken a page out of Popoff's playbook. It's conceivable, I guess. The leaking of hacked materials for political and strategic effect, the amplification of existing geopolitical tensions, even the flair for the dramatic with the hacker manifestos and PhineasFisher releasing those and the trolling on Twitter, all of that feels very Popoff-esque to me. Of course, this is all just informed speculation on my part, based on a theory or hypothesis of the episode. I'm not even sure I have enough evidence to call this a theory. As I stated a little earlier, NKWT Group reemerged, a group that Popoff was mixed up in. They took credit for multiple data dumps that were also tied to Popoff originally. And this group is also allegedly a group doing the work for the Russian government, either by contractors or just actual government officials. It's kind of unclear. But another attack NKW took credit for was hackingteam.it. Does that sound familiar?
It's PhineasFisher, yeah, I'm back in the scene. A hacker on a mission, disrupting the machine. Hacking team took them down with finesse. For the rules and the truth, man, you know I confess. Read the Citizen Lab, saw the messed up report. PhineasFisher and the others, just a crooked cohort. I don't do it for the fame, not for the glory. Just to give the targets a break, that's my story. Anti-surveillance, yeah, that's my fight. Exposing all of that.
Always framing their actions as like a fight for transparency and justice. NKWT, on the other hand, is believed to operate at the behest of the Russian intelligence service, conducting espionage and disinformation campaigns to further Russia's strategic interests. Allegedly. Which this seems fitting, as this is the PhineasFisher Russian identity theory episode. Both have also shown a motivation for going after Western government law enforcement targets. PhineasFisher has hit the Catalan police union, while NKWT has breached the Italian police as well as their government. And while their motivations may differ, both frame their actions as a kind of guerrilla counterintelligence, unmasking the misdeeds of the powerful state actors. So is it possible there's a more direct link between PhineasFisher and NKWT? Could PhineasFisher have been a former member of the group before striking out on their own hacktivist path? Moonlighting is a thing after all, even in the hacker world. Sure, in the West, these skill sets are highly compensated and rewarded, but that's not always the case. Popoff talked about this and made claims that Eastern Bloc hackers would love to make an honest living with their brains, but that only way that they could make money with their brains was by doing crime. The ISIN leak gave us a glimpse of what Chinese contractors tied to attacks from APT groups dubbed Red Hotel or Red Alpha or Poison Carp complained about when they're low wages. Iranian moonlighting ransomware attacks of the Cobalt Mirage crew is another example of kind of dual-use attackers. Maybe PhineasFisher is just a silly moniker or persona NKWT made up. Or it's a Russian contractor. Or an NKWT member, Russian contractor together. Or maybe it's just someone completely different. Maybe they didn't think the legend of PhineasFisher would explode in popularity. They have hinted at this. And the Vice article, PhineasFisher said through a puppet that the name was a dumb play on the words PhineasFisher, the name of the surveillance kit sold by Gamma Group. In a later interview, PhineasFisher expressed how this kind of got bigger than they thought. It's a tantalizing theory or theories, and there are certainly some breadcrumbs that point in that direction. Man, conspiracy theories can be fun. I can see how people get into this stuff. But it's interesting, the overlap that is, that I don't think this points to conclusively or actually a hard data point. But you can see the similarities in the way they operate. Speaking of overlap, let's talk about an IP address. In my opinion, the most interesting part of this theory is the IP address 5.149.249.172. And I like hard evidence, though. Through collaboration with Threat Connect, the FBI issued a series of flashes about Russian activity in two states' election systems. I'm quoting a Security Affairs article that quotes the original Threat Connect analysis. I'll include all of this in the show notes. Quote, however, as we looked into the 5.149.249.172 IP address within the FBI Flash Bulletin, we uncovered a spear phishing campaign targeting Turkey's ruling Justice and Development, AK, Party, Ukrainian Parliament, and the German Freedom Party figures from March through August of 2016. That fits a known Russian targeting focus and modus operandi, states the analysis published by Threat Connect. As we explore malicious activity in the IP ranges around 5.149.249.172, we found additional linkages back to activity that could be evidence of Russian Advanced Persistence Threat, APT, activity. This connection around the 5.149.249.172 activity is more suggestive of state-backed rather than criminally motivated activity. Although we are unable to assess which actor or group might be behind the attacks based on the current evidence. End quote. In addition to all this, more data points were presented. All of the IP addresses, 6 in total in the flash, including the 5.149.249.172, belong to Fort Unix infrastructure. Now, this is interesting as it's a known playground for Russian activity. The DDoS activities on the Ukrainian media and ICS power grid attacks also utilize Fort Unix infrastructure. These are also the attacks that were leading up to and around the time of NotPetya was released. Episode 1 kind of describes this more in detail. Essentially, Ukraine was like the Russian cyber weapons proving ground for a bit. But 5.149.249.172 hosted a Russian cybercrime market from January to May of 2015, approximately 1 year prior to these activities. I'm going to quote some more from the Security Affairs article. Quote, the phishing campaigns mentioned in the analysis exploited an open source phishing framework called Phishing Frenzy. The security experts managed to hack into the control panel of the system used by the phishers and discovered a total of 113 emails written in Ukrainian, Turkish, German, and English. Out of the 113 total emails, 48 of them were malicious messages targeting Gmail accounts, while the rest were specifically designed to look like an email from an organization of interest for the victims. 16 of the malicious emails used to target AK party officials were also included in the WikiLeaks dump of nearly 300,000 AK party emails disclosed in July. End quote. Slight tangent. Phishing Frenzy is an open source Ruby on Rails email phishing framework designed to help penetration testers manage multiple complex phishing campaigns. As you can tell, it's written in Ruby on Rails, so that suggests that it quit being maintained years ago, as like most Ruby on Rails projects. Anyway, the stated goal of the project is to streamline the phishing process while still providing clients the best realistic phishing campaigns possible. The goal is attainable through campaign management, template reuse, statistical generation, and other features that Frenzy has to offer. I use the description from darknet.org.uk. I'll link it and give them credit. Now, throwing aside the philosophical debate of should we be writing open source malware or offensive tools, it appears that threat actors use this platform for real-life campaigns. Lowering the bar to phishing gets more phishing, and they probably violated the license agreement of the tool. But back to Comrade PhineasFisher. Let's unpack some of these statements. Quote, 16 of the malicious emails used to target AK party officials were also included in the WikiLeaks dump of nearly 300,000 AK party emails disclosed in July. Now, this suggests that since the emails were found in the dump, that they were part of the breach for AKP. Or that's maybe how people interpreted it. But it also could mean that the phishing emails were just in the dump, suggesting that someone sent a malicious phishing email to AKP party members and someone else dumped those emails containing the docs. Actor A sends the emails, Actor B dumps the lot of emails containing the phishing emails. But it could also mean that the phishing emails were used to gain access to the AKP servers. Remember, as I said, we don't have a hackback manifesto for the AKP attack from PhineasFisher. The best we have is an interview PhineasFisher did with Vice magazine, and they basically just said nothing went right. The AKP attack was also interrupted by WikiLeaks' early release and the suspected coup going on. And just a lot of geopolitics was going on at the time. As I've said before, hacking Turkey just felt weird for the PhineasFisher persona. Sure, Turkey got real authoritarian in 2016. Erdogan and the AKP cracked down on a lot of freedoms. PhineasFisher doesn't appear to be a big fan of authoritarian regimes or the people that supply them. This checks out, sort of. But why target the AKP on behalf of the Kurds? And why was PhineasFisher in there at the same time of the coup? Bad timing? And personally, the Kurds' cause sounds weak, but maybe I'm missing some context. But it feels like something Popov would have said. As we talked about earlier, Popov had all these weird stories and personas with different goals, even being at odds with one another. And not saying Popov is PhineasFisher, just that maybe it acted as a sort of playbook or a blueprint. Okay, I'm going around in circles a little bit. I think we get the point here. It's just weird. But going back to the IP address, hosting a Russian cybercrime market from January to May of 2015, approximately 1 year prior to those activities. Well, IP addresses being reassigned is a thing. That's why IOCs go stale, and we know from the Pyramid of Pain that IP addresses aren't a strong IOC and can be changed quite easily. So could that be the case here? Sure. Could it be that a Russian APT operator was hosting a side hustle? Sure. We already know that moonlighting is a thing. Maybe Yuri sees all of his buddies driving around in Lambos on the street of Moscow and thinks, if I'm going to be called a fancy bear, I might as well be fancy. Then he pulls himself up from his bootstraps, the cyber criminal way, and opens a sketchy cybercrime market. It's the Russian hacker dream. Or it could just be an IP address being reassigned. This suggests that the connection could very well be Russian, but makes the attribution between state-sponsored and criminal very cloudy. But for what it's worth, with the use of contractors and the lax nature for prosecuting cyber crimes against the West in general, in Russia, it's already cloudy. The last part of this puzzle around this idea is the connection between WikiLeaks, the Turkish coup attempt, and Russia. Despite what is assumed these days, I haven't been convinced that Assange knew Guccifer 2.0 was a Russian op when they assisted in the publishing of the DNC emails. I think he got those emails, assumed they looked authentic, felt it was his responsibility or the responsibility of WikiLeaks to share it, and they did. I've always assumed that publishing of those emails were in the name of getting attention, not being a Russian asset. In an attention-driven world, being first is the currency, and sometimes the cost is reputation or accuracy. Look, I know he helped spread documents he shouldn't have, and definitely crossed the journalistic line when telling Manning how to commit a crime, and even had involvement with Popov and Sabu's stuff. I'm just saying, I don't think that this was an allegiance to Russia as much as it was in furtherance of his own ego, which, in my opinion, is playing the short game instead of the long game. But then again, this is one of the reasons why people don't trust media organizations. Earlier from last year, a rocket from within Gaza exploded in a hospital parking lot. The Palestinian Health Authority told the New York Times that at least 500 people were killed by an Israeli airstrike on a hospital. That sounds bad. Really bad. The New York Times publishes this news. More news agencies see that the report is coming from the Times, and they circulated it as well. Independent analysis of the video evidence and photos reveal that the explosion looked rather small for an Israeli airstrike, and it was in a parking lot, which led to them questioning the 500 victim total that was provided by the Ministry of Health. Now, you would have thought that they would have questioned the number since it was coming from a Palestinian health ministry, being as that is led by Hamas, like every other government body in Gaza, but that escaped them as well in an effort to be first. Now, I know some people listening may say the New York Times was also anti-Israel and wanted to push some sort of agenda like that. Maybe it's true. I personally think it was a desire to scoop the story, but I'm not married to this idea. I'm not trying to dwell on this. I just wanted to give an example that may be fresh in people's mind. Either way, the editorial board added a revision. The early versions of this coverage and the prominence it received in a headline, news alert, and social media channels relied too heavily on claims by Hamas and did not make clear that those claims could not be independently verified. The newspaper admitted the reporters left readers with an incorrect impression about what was known and how credible the account was. And it concluded, Times editors should have taken more care with this initial presentation. But as you can imagine, no one's going to read that. How many times do you go back to the New York Times website to reread an article you read a week ago? And I don't even know if this was circulated or if this is true, but I doubt that they were circulating a revised, updated story on social media saying, hey, the editors posted a revision note. That looks bad for them. But what did it do? Well, it damaged their credibility and reputation, which is important if you're the New York Times, or it planted misinformation in the heads of people towards the Israeli airstrikes in Gaza in response to the October 7th attack. Now, I'm not trying to pick a side in this. I'm just using it as a recent data point, as maybe it would illustrate the reason why this could happen with WikiLeaks and Guccifer 2.0. WikiLeaks also made a mistake when they published the database from the AKP. I touched on this in the last episode, but in an effort to stay within the news cycles for the failed coup on President Erdogan, WikiLeaks jumped the gun and published the AKP email dump while PhineasFisher was still in the network. But according to some of the other analysis, the Threat Connect reporting specifically, those email domains were used in an attack that was registered months before the coup and the initial breach. Ultimately, this focuses on timing. Was it dumb luck that PhineasFisher was in there at the same time or party to the Russians helping notify Turkey of the impending coup? Who knows? Also, PhineasFisher's own private dump, where they exposed the addresses of people in Turkey, was also claimed to be a dump from a previous attack in 2011. I haven't been able to validate this with great sources, though. It appears it's just Turkish government officials saying this, but this could line up with the republishing of old dump. NKWT was doing this all the time with dumps that Popoff would claim credit for. It's just a thought. There was also an avatar from PhineasFisher's 2016 Twitter page with recording artist Timati. I think that's how you say it, name. It's a guy holding a keyboard guitar. Now, why is this significant? Well, this artist has made political support videos for President Putin in 2012 and 2018. So why would this dude be on PhineasFisher's radar? My assumption, as always, has been that PhineasFisher was a native Spanish speaker from like Spain or somewhere in South America. But this idea can be conflicted as the AKP attack is kind of weird for a native Spanish speaker in one of those countries. However, the opposite is also true. Why is this Russian person cosplaying a Spanish-speaking PhineasFisher so good? Did they spend time in Cuba? Could they have spent time in Cuba? Sure. So back to the Twitter picture. Could this be a dumb picture that PhineasFisher found without knowing who the person was? Absolutely. Could it be that they were Russian, knew who this was, and was overworked and they made a mistake? Absolutely. Could it be something completely different? Absolutely. And with that, I think this is a good place to end this episode. Ultimately, I don't know if we'll ever know who PhineasFisher was. This episode was fun and different for me, as I have to speculate more than I'm really comfortable with. I like data points around real pieces of evidence. Plus, admittedly, I like the story of a hacktivist who pwns evil corporations, F society status, and Mr. Robot. Not another weird Russian op information war thing. I guess this is interesting as well, like what made it so effective, but I digress. So was PhineasFisher or is PhineasFisher a Russian op? I think it's inclusive. But given the history of Popoff and his tactics, the NKWT similarities, the FBI flash on the IP address, connections to WikiLeaks, and just other data points, it's probably stronger than I would originally gave it credit for. On our next episode in the series, we'll wrap up the PhineasFisher series with part 5, in which we talk about the bug bounty program and the legacy of Hackback. If you would like to hear more, please visit the website at intrusions.com, where you'll find more stories on high-profile intrusions and the threat actors that conduct them. I'm Josh Stepp. Thanks for listening.
Oh, yeah.